Hello and welcome back to The History Freak, and today I'm starting my Stuart Queen series with a woman who became Queen of Scotland as well as England, and that's Anne of Denmark. I was actually really excited to learn more about Anne, as this is a queen I knew so little about. Possibly due to lack of influence over her husband the king, she has been described as boring, trivial, and harshly as stupid. Having taken a closer look, I think Anne needs more attention. Before we start, why not subscribe to this channel and press that notification button, and you won't miss any of the fabulous Stuart videos we have planned. And of course, if you're a fan of the Tudors, check out our channel as we have a heap of videos covering the Tudor period. Okay, let's learn about Anne of Denmark. Anne of Denmark was born in December 1574, not surprisingly, in Denmark. Her mother was Sophie from a German principality, and her father Frederick was the King of Denmark. Apparently, far from being happy about being blessed with a daughter, he was quite disappointed Anne wasn't a boy. Anne had a very happy childhood. Her family, in some ways unusual for royals, were extremely close. As a princess, Anne was sought after for marriage. Of course, royal matches were made for political reasons, and Scottish King James seemed an attractive match to Denmark due to the fact that he had a good shot at becoming King of England. He was a close relative of the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, and she had no children. So if James were to become king, whoever married him becomes queen of both England and Scotland. It wasn't a sure thing, as Elizabeth was reluctant to name her successor, and there were complicated rules. Ultimately, nearly 15 years after the marriage of Anne and James in 1603, he did in fact become king of both countries. Go James! When Anne was around 13, her father died, and her 11-year-old brother became the new King of Denmark. Anne's mother was involved in the complicated business of securing Anne's marriage to James, and by 1589 it was agreed. Anne was very excited for marriage with James. He was about 8 years older, and she seemed to convince herself she was in love before they even met. James, it seems, was also excited for the marriage. Now, of course, James is well known for having had very close relationships with men. It's thought that even when he was as young as 14, he had had a close relationship with a man that had caused his nobleman concern. Of course, we look at sexuality very differently now than how they did back then. I really like the fact that history hasn't seemed to define or criticise James for what it's assumed he was into in the bedroom. Despite what many have believed in the past, sexuality is not always one thing or another. It's very complicated, and regardless of his closeness to other men, it certainly didn't mean he couldn't marry a woman, have a certain level of genuine caring for her, and produce children, as these things are exactly what he did. In 1589, Anne and James were married by proxy, and Anne sailed for Scotland. But bad weather prevented her from reaching her new home, and she ended up in Oslo. This was not a good start for the couple, and James was distressed. James, throughout his life, was known to have a strong fear of witches, and it seems he believed the problems Anne had crossing the sea could have been down to evil doings by witches. James, not wanting to wait for Anne to arrive, decided he would go to her. The couple met for the first time and were married in Oslo. It seems it was a happy start, there was much celebration, and they spent time visiting Anne's beloved family. In 1590, Anne finally made it to Scotland and was crowned at Holyrood Abbey. Anne now had to begin the tricky journey of making the Scottish people like her, and some felt she didn't start well, as she was more keen to spend time with her Danish companions, and was even described as being aloof and proud. It must be so hard for such a young girl in a foreign land to get everything right. Almost impossible, I would say. Despite their initial closeness, it seems Anne and James were quite different and possibly lacked the chemistry to make them both happy. James even described marriage as misery. It seems they had a lot of petty arguments and they certainly disagreed on things. But it also seems there was respect and some genuine caring between them, and they got on well enough to exist somewhat happily through the years. In 1594, Anne gave birth to the couple's first child, a son, and this was a relief to everyone. Of course, the top job was to produce an heir, but the fact that it had taken some time did not help with the rumours about James and his male favourites. Henry Frederick was the first of 7 children born to the couple, but only 3 of these would survive infancy. Different ideas about how the prince should be brought up caused much difficulty for the couple. Remember, Anne had come from a very close and happy family, but James wanted his son brought up away for his safety and for custom. This was such a cause of misery for Anne, so much so that it suggested she refused to talk to James and at times even refused food, but ultimately there was little she could do, as James was adamant about his son's upbringing, but the damage to the relationship with Anne was huge. It's thought she was so upset and worked up about the situation, she suffered a miscarriage because of it. As I said before, in 1603, James became King of England as well as Scotland. The two were still run separately, but James ruled both. With Prince Henry and Princess Elizabeth, Anne travelled south to London. England was a wealthy country, and it seems they were both happy to be there. This could certainly be true based on how little time James spent in Scotland after this point. The transition wasn't totally smooth, however. Some were not happy about the situation, and the famous gunpowder plot of 1605 was a failed plan to blow up James and Parliament. The move to England did little to help relations between Anne and James. In fact, if anything, they seemed to move further apart as a couple. They started spending more time apart, and when Anne decided she wanted no more children, the reason for them to be together became less and less. There were also religious tensions between them, and James started to get even closer to male favourites, which would have been tough for Anne. So what did Anne do with her time? Well, she loved masks, fashion, plays, architecture, art, and jewels, and she was not afraid to spend a lot of money on these things. She actually liked to perform herself, and at times she encouraged other females to perform. These events were attended by many and are said to have been quite spectacular. There was tragedy in 1612 when Prince Henry died aged 18. Both parents were devastated. It's said she could not even face talking about him without getting very emotional. Anne, who was known for being a queen that loved to have fun and enjoy the finer things in life, started to withdraw more and more from public life. It was now her younger son Charles who was the heir to the throne, and he would of course in time become King Charles I. Over time, Anne's health suffered. She eventually died after a long illness on the 2nd of March 1619, aged just 44. It was said Charles was with her at the end, but James was not. However, it is said James did feel upset by her passing. He died himself in 1625, and the couple are buried together in Westminster Abbey. Having taken a closer look, I sort of understand why Anne seems to have been lost in the mix a bit. She doesn't have the dramatic moments like some other queens from the past, like Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth of York, but she certainly wasn't boring as some have described her. Her biggest problem in life, and as a person to be remembered through history, is that as we have seen, she wasn't able to get much influence over James or the court. Her story is more about a personal journey. She was actually just somebody who wanted to love her family. But I would like to see her and this period of time get more attention. That's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Why not put in the comments any of your thoughts about Anne? And join us in our upcoming video when we'll be talking about Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot.